At exactly 7:42 p.m. on a cold Michigan evening, a telephone rang inside a quiet suburban home, and in that single ordinary moment, a family's entire future collapsed without warning, without mercy, and without explanation, because the voice that came through that line belonged to a 12-year-old boy who sounded calm, polite, and completely unaware that he was speaking for the last time in his life. He told his mother that he would be home soon, that he was just finishing something, that she shouldn't worry, and that he loved her, and she smiled as she hung up the phone, never realizing that she had just heard the final echo of her son's existence before he vanished into a darkness so deep that even 50 years later, it still refuses to release its secrets. For years, the families of Oakland County would replay the same haunting question in their minds. How did we not see it coming? How did we not know that while we were tucking our children into bed, while we were kissing their foreheads, while we were telling them to be home before dark, someone else was studying them with deadly patience. Someone else was memorizing their routines. Someone else was planning something so cruel, so calculated, and so cold that even decades later, investigators still struggle to explain how he got away with it. Because this is not just a story about missing children. This is a story about a killer who left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no clear witnesses, no definitive identity, no confession, no closure. It is the story of a monster who slipped through the cracks of law enforcement, through the fears of parents, and through the cracks of time itself. And to this day, his name remains unknown. Before we dive deeper into this chilling mystery, take a moment to support Dr. Crime Stories by gently tapping the like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue bringing you deeply researched, emotionally powerful stories like this one, and it ensures you never miss the truth hidden behind history's darkest cases. Now, let us take you back to a time when children still rode their bikes until sunset, when parents still believed their neighborhoods were safe, and when nobody imagined that evil could disguise itself so well. In the early 1970s, Oakland County represented the American dream in its most comforting form, with wide streets lined by mature trees, neatly trimmed lawns stretching in front of brick homes, children riding bicycles until sunset, and neighbors who believed that danger belonged to distant cities rather than their peaceful communities. Parents trusted that their children could walk to nearby stores, visit friends, and play outdoors without fear, because crime was something they read about in newspapers, not something they expected to encounter in their own backyards. This sense of security was not careless. It was built on years of stability, shared values, and mutual trust, and it had convinced families that their environment was fundamentally safe. That belief, however, would soon be shattered by a series of events so disturbing and inexplicable that they would permanently alter the psychological landscape of the entire region. The first major fracture in this illusion of safety occurred in October 1971, when 10-year-old Daniel Crouch stepped outside his home to play, following a routine that had never before placed him in danger, and disappeared within minutes without a sound, without witnesses, and without any sign of struggle, leaving behind only his abandoned bicycle as a silent testament to how quickly a life could vanish in a place that once felt protected. Search parties formed immediately. Neighbors combed nearby streets and wooded areas, and police officers questioned everyone who might have seen something unusual. Yet despite these efforts, days passed without answers, and hope slowly transformed into despair when Daniel's body was discovered in a remote area, revealing signs of sexual assault and strangulation, as well as evidence that someone had taken time to clean him after death, indicating a level of calculation and emotional detachment that deeply unsettled investigators. 2 years later, the nightmare repeated itself when 13-year-old Michael Skakel vanished under similarly ordinary circumstances, leaving his family trapped in the same agonizing cycle of uncertainty, desperate searching, and eventual devastation when his body was found bearing the same horrifying markers of violence and deliberate concealment. By this point, law enforcement officials began to recognize that these were not isolated tragedies, but interconnected crimes committed by someone who possessed both patience and planning, someone who studied his victims carefully, selected them deliberately, and executed his actions with chilling precision. Each new discovery reinforced the terrifying reality that a predator was operating within their midst, exploiting the community's trust and using it as a tool to access children without raising suspicion. As more boys disappeared over the following years, including Robert Piest and Timothy King, patterns became increasingly clear to investigators, even as concrete evidence remained elusive. Witnesses described seeing the victims speaking calmly with adult men, entering vehicles willingly, and behaving as though they were interacting with someone familiar or authoritative, which suggested that the killer relied not on physical force, but on psychological manipulation, using charm, credibility, and carefully crafted deception to gain compliance. This realization profoundly disturbed police officers and parents alike, because it meant the danger did not come from dark alleys or violent confrontations, but from conversations that appear harmless and interactions that seemed safe. Behind the scenes, one of the largest investigative efforts in Michigan's history was launched, involving hundreds of officers, thousands of interviews, and extensive cooperation between local, state, and federal agencies. Yet despite this massive mobilization of resources, the investigation repeatedly stalled as suspects were cleared, leads collapsed, and promising theories failed to withstand scrutiny. Quietly, some detectives began to suspect that the killer might occupy a position of social authority, such as a teacher, coach, counselor, or volunteer, someone whose role naturally inspired trust and obedience, enabling him to approach children without resistance and move through communities without attracting attention. If this theory was correct, then the monster responsible for these crimes might have attended memorial services, participated in searches, and offered comfort to grieving families, hiding in plain sight while appearing compassionate and helpful. Perhaps the most unsettling element of the case was not merely the brutality of the murders, but the fact that they suddenly stopped without explanation after 1976, leaving behind no arrest, no confession, and no definitive resolution. Only a haunting silence that raised more questions than answers. Did the killer die, relocate, or find a way to conceal his activities permanently? Or was he still living an ordinary life somewhere, carrying secrets that would never be revealed? The absence of closure transformed these crimes from historical tragedies into enduring psychological wounds that continue to affect families and communities even decades later. If this story has moved you so far, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because your engagement helps ensure that these voices are not lost to history. When the fourth boy was found dead and the reality of a serial predator could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, the atmosphere inside Oakland County's police departments shifted from cautious concern to quiet desperation, because every unanswered question now carried the unbearable weight of another potential life lost, and every failed lead reinforced the terrifying truth that the person responsible was always several steps ahead of those sworn to stop him. Detectives who had once approached the case with methodical confidence began working through sleepless nights, surrounded by overflowing file cabinets, hand-drawn timelines, and stacks of interview transcripts, desperately searching for patterns that might reveal the killer's identity. Yet with each passing month, the investigation seemed to expand outward rather than narrow inward, creating a labyrinth of possibilities instead of a clear path toward justice. One of the earliest and most troubling realizations to emerge from the evidence was that none of the victims showed signs of forced abduction, which suggested that they had entered vehicles voluntarily or followed their killer willingly. A fact that deeply unsettled both investigators and parents because it implied a level of psychological control far more frightening than brute violence. Witnesses repeatedly described seeing the boys speaking calmly with adult men, appearing relaxed and cooperative, and behaving as though they were interacting with someone they trusted or respected, which led behavioral analysts to propose that the killer likely possessed strong interpersonal skills, an ability to read emotional cues, and a practiced talent for manipulating children into compliance without triggering fear. This profile immediately narrowed the field of potential suspects to individuals who regularly interacted with young people and who occupied positions that naturally commanded authority. As this theory gained traction, attention began to turn quietly toward teachers, youth counselors, religious leaders, coaches, and community volunteers, individuals who enjoyed unrestricted access to children and whose reputations were built on public trust. However, pursuing these suspects proved extraordinarily difficult. not only because many were respected figures with powerful social connections, but also because accusing them without definitive evidence risked destroying innocent lives and provoking public backlash. Internal memos revealed that detectives were often discouraged from aggressively interrogating certain individuals, either due to political considerations, institutional pressures, or concerns about lawsuits, creating an invisible barrier that prevented some of the most promising leads from being fully explored. Among the most controversial figures to attract police attention was a local businessman with deep ties to youth organizations and a long history of volunteering at community events, whose name appeared repeatedly in witness statements and anonymous tips. Several parents reported that their sons had interacted with him shortly before disappearing, and former associates described unsettling behavior patterns that included inappropriate interest in young boys and a tendency to offer unsolicited rides. Despite these troubling indicators, surveillance yielded no conclusive proof. Forensic evidence was inconclusive, and key witnesses later recanted or modified their statements under unexplained circumstances, leaving investigators unable to build a case strong enough to withstand legal scrutiny. Simultaneously, law enforcement explored the possibility that the murders were connected to organized exploitation networks operating beyond state borders, a theory fueled by reports of suspicious vehicles with out-of-state plates and by intelligence, suggesting that some victims may have been transported across county lines before being killed. Federal agencies were quietly consulted, and information was exchanged with task forces in neighboring states. Yet these efforts produced little more than fragmented data and unverified rumors. Each new theory seemed plausible in isolation, but none could be assembled into a coherent narrative that explained every known detail of the crimes. Perhaps the most damaging obstacle to progress was the absence of usable forensic evidence, because despite the killer's repeated physical contact with his victims, investigators found no recoverable fingerprints, no usable DNA, and no consistent trace materials linking the crimes together. This absence was not accidental. It reflected deliberate actions taken to eliminate identifying markers, including thorough cleaning, strategic disposal of clothing, and careful selection of remote dump sites. To experienced detectives, this level of operational discipline suggested prior criminal experience or extensive research, reinforcing fears that they were dealing with someone who understood investigative procedures and actively designed his methods to defeat them. Behind closed doors, frustrations mounted as case files grew thicker and prospects grew thinner, and some officers began to privately question whether institutional failures had already compromised the investigation beyond repair. Records later revealed instances in which evidence had been mishandled, interviews improperly documented, and critical reports delayed or lost, creating gaps in the timeline that could never be reconstructed. While no single mistake could be blamed for the lack of arrests, the cumulative effect of these errors created an environment in which uncertainty flourished and accountability diminished. As years passed without resolution, political pressure intensified, and officials became increasingly concerned about public confidence, tourism, and property values, prompting subtle shifts in how information was released and how aggressively certain lines of inquiry were pursued. Press conferences emphasized ongoing efforts and renewed commitment, yet internally, resources were gradually diverted to newer cases, and veteran detectives were reassigned or retired, taking with them invaluable institutional knowledge. Families who requested updates were often met with polite reassurances and vague promises, masking the reality that meaningful progress had largely stalled. For the victims' parents, this stagnation was a second form of suffering, because each unanswered letter and unreturned phone call reinforced the sense that their children's lives were being quietly relegated to history rather than actively defended in the present. Many began conducting their own investigations, compiling private archives of documents, interviewing former classmates, and maintaining informal networks of information exchange, refusing to allow the case to fade into obscurity. Their persistence preserved critical details that might otherwise have been lost, and ensured that uncomfortable questions continued to surface long after official interest had waned. Yet perhaps the most haunting possibility to emerge from these years of uncertainty was that the killer had never truly disappeared, but had simply adapted, changed locations, or integrated seamlessly into another community, carrying his secrets undetected. Behavioral specialists noted that individuals capable of such sustained deception often excel at compartmentalization, allowing them to function outwardly as responsible citizens while internally maintaining hidden identities. If this assessment was accurate, then the Oakland County Child Killer might still be living among ordinary families, attending social gatherings, and participating in civic life, untouched by suspicion and shielded by time. If this story has affected you, please remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because your engagement helps keep these unresolved cases alive and prevents silence from becoming the final verdict. In the years following the gradual release of sealed documents and suppressed materials, the Oakland County Child Killer case entered its most unsettling phase, not because answers were finally emerging, but because the fragments of truth now visible suggested that the mystery had never been as impenetrable as authorities once claimed. Instead, it appeared increasingly likely that the solution had hovered within reach for decades, obscured not by a lack of evidence, but by hesitation, institutional fear, and an unwillingness to confront uncomfortable realities about who the killer might have been. As independent investigators, journalists, and legal advocates pieced together the scattered remnants of the original inquiry, they began noticing patterns that had been largely ignored in official reports. Several witnesses from the 1970s had independently described a man who approached children with remarkable confidence and calm, often presenting himself as someone affiliated with community programs, schools, or youth organizations. He spoke with authority, displayed familiarity with adult supervision systems, and possessed the social intelligence required to disarm suspicion within seconds. Yet despite the consistency of these descriptions, no comprehensive public profile had ever been released, and no coordinated effort had been made to track individuals fitting this behavioral pattern across jurisdictions. What made this omission even more troubling was the discovery that at least 3 men fitting this description had been questioned extensively during the investigation's early years, only to later disappear from the narrative entirely. Their files contained inconsistencies, partial confessions that were never formalized, and unexplained gaps in surveillance records. In one case, a suspect had reportedly failed a polygraph examination related to his whereabouts on the day of a disappearance, yet subsequent reports reclassified the result as inconclusive, effectively neutralizing its significance. In another instance, a man linked to multiple victims through overlapping social networks had relocated suddenly after being questioned, and no documented attempt was made to pursue him. These anomalies fueled a new wave of theorizing that the killer may not have been a lone predator operating in isolation, but someone embedded within respected institutions who benefited from indirect protection, whether intentional or accidental. This possibility challenged the long-standing narrative of an anonymous monster lurking in shadows and suggested, instead, that the perpetrator may have walked openly through neighborhoods, attended public events, and interacted daily with families who never imagined he could be responsible for such horror. Modern forensic efforts, though constrained by degraded evidence, nonetheless produced several breakthroughs that reignited public attention. Advanced DNA testing performed on preserved fibers and biological material ruled out numerous individuals previously considered suspects, while simultaneously narrowing the field toward a smaller cluster of unknown profiles. Though insufficient for public identification, these results contradicted earlier conclusions and indicated that key assumptions had been flawed from the beginning. For many observers, this reinforced the belief that the investigation's early missteps had redirected resources away from the most promising leads. Perhaps the most haunting development came when a former federal consultant, who had reviewed portions of the case during the 1980s, released a private journal documenting his concerns about political interference. According to his writings, certain lines of inquiry had been discouraged because they threatened influential community relationships and risked triggering lawsuits. While he stopped short of naming specific individuals, his entries described meetings in which risk management was discussed alongside murder investigations, a juxtaposition that revealed how institutional priorities had sometimes eclipsed moral responsibility. As public interest surged once again, advocacy groups pushed for the creation of an independent cold case task force, arguing that only a body free from historical entanglements could evaluate the evidence objectively. Although such proposals gained momentum, bureaucratic delays and funding disputes slowed progress, leaving families once more trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment. Still, their determination never wavered, and several parents, now elderly, continued attending hearings and interviews, insisting that they would not rest until their children's names were associated with truth rather than uncertainty. Psychological profilers who revisited the case in recent years emphasized that the killer's ability to evade detection for so long indicated not only intelligence, but deep familiarity with investigative procedures. He likely monitored media coverage closely, adjusted his behavior in response to police strategies, and understood how to exploit jurisdictional boundaries. Such traits suggested prior exposure to law enforcement systems, whether through professional experience, close associations, or extensive personal study. This realization prompted renewed scrutiny of individuals with backgrounds in security, corrections, and auxiliary policing roles during the 1970s. Yet despite these advances, the case remains unresolved, suspended between partial clarity and enduring darkness. Each newly uncovered detail seems to illuminate one corner of the mystery, while casting deeper shadows elsewhere, creating the painful impression that the truth exists just beyond reach. For the families, this limbo is perhaps the cruelest outcome of all, because it denies them both closure and the certainty that justice was fully pursued. What makes the Oakland County Child Killer case so enduring is not only the brutality of the crimes, but the collective failure that followed them, a failure shaped by hesitation, misplaced priorities, and an unwillingness to confront uncomfortable possibilities. It stands as a reminder that evil does not always hide in obvious places, and that systems designed to protect can sometimes become obstacles to accountability. Even today, somewhere, someone may still hold a crucial piece of this puzzle, a memory, a document, a confession, or a fragment of information that could finally bring resolution. Until that moment arrives, the voices of the victims' families, researchers, and concerned citizens remain the strongest defense against forgetting. If this story has moved you, challenged you, or made you reflect on the fragile line between justice and neglect, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps ensure that these children are never reduced to forgotten headlines, and that their stories continue to be told until the truth is finally revealed.